Okay, so we're going to be talking about 3.2 K-selected and R-selected species. And so K population rates with populations of organisms depend on reproductive strategy success. So the rate at which the population grows depends upon how successful organisms are at reproduction. And so there are a lot of factors that determine the ease or the benefit or the success, I guess, of the reproductive strategy. And so that is the average size of the species, the requirements for parental care, the number of offspring that the organisms have, the competition for resources, the organism's role in ecological succession, and then whether or not the species is an invasive species or if it's impacted by invasive species. These are all things that can help determine the success of the reproductive strategy of the organisms. Okay, so in this case, when we're talking about these reproductive strategies, we're talking about either K-selected species or R-selected species, and these two different types of strategies really come down to quality over quantity. And so K-selective species are organisms that have very few offspring. So when I think of that, I think of like in the last picture, there was a picture of an elephant. Elephants generally have maybe one singleton in there when they have a baby, or sometimes they'll have twins. It's more rare for that to happen. And they also have, so they have very few offspring, but they also have put in a lot, they invest a lot of parental care in order to feed and protect and make sure that that baby elephant grows into an adult. So it's very costly for elephants to have babies, just like it is for humans, actually. And they usually reproduce many times. So they don't just have one litter and then move on and sometimes even die. Like there are insect species that literally give birth and then die. These organisms, usually mammals, birds, will have babies every season. So they usually, these organisms have a long lifespan so that they can reproduce a number of times. And it usually takes a long time for these organisms to develop into sexual maturity. So, because of that, we say that they have a low biotic potential, which means that the amount of babies that they can have, or the amount of times they can reproduce, the number of offspring that they have, is relatively low in ideal conditions. So, again, low biotic potential. They also have a slow population growth rate. So, elephants just aren't going to take over the world in the next couple of days because they're not having that many babies. So, and they are also more likely to be disrupted by environmental change or invasive species. So, these are all the characteristics of K selected species. Then we have the other type of species or reproductive strategy known as an R selected species. And these organisms have many offspring. They usually have very little care to absolutely no care. And when I think of that, I think of like a sea turtle has absolutely zero parental care. They come in, they bury their eggs. I guess it's a little bit of parental care. They bury the eggs, but then they leave and they never see their babies again. So, low or no parental care. They usually only reproduce once, not always the case. Like a sea turtle is not a great example for that. They'll reproduce every season. But there are some types of insects, like I say, that only reproduce the one time. And then there are some types of fish and plants that do this as well. These R selected species have a shorter lifespan. It usually takes them very little time to advance through development to sexual maturity. They have a very high biotic potential. In other words, under ideal conditions, they can have a very high reproductive rate, which, because of this, they then have a very high population growth rate. These organisms are more likely to be invasive because they're better suited for rapidly changing environmental conditions. Okay, so again, here's just a chart to show all of those different traits. Actually, it's not probably, it is important that you know all of these different characteristics of the K selected versus R selected species. So this would be a good chart to make sure that we get into our notes. The other thing, just like with generalist and specialist species, R and K selected species are, it's a definite spectrum. So you can have things that are like an oyster that has no parental contact versus a chimpanzee. These oysters have 500 million, can potentially have 5 million offspring in a year, where a chimpanzee has one offspring every 5 years. And then you've got things even in between where a frog might have 200 offspring a year and a rabbit will have 12 offspring a year. So, again, this is a spectrum, and there's sort of some gray area in the middle. Okay, there's a spectrum of parental care. You can see here this rabbit's nursing, so it does give some parental care to its offspring. This frog is carrying around larvae on their back, so again, parental care, some level of care there. With invasiveness and disturbances, there's also some differences between these two types of species. Again, I mentioned before that K-selective species have a low biotic potential, whereas R-selected have a high biotic potential. This makes it hard for a K-selected species for its population to recover after some sort of a disturbance or environmental change. They also have high parental care, whereas R-selected have a low parental care. This means that the death of the parent, let's say that a bird is feeding its offspring in a nest and the parent dies, the offspring will die as well. This does not impact R-selected species. A sea turtle dies after laying its eggs. The eggs can still, hatch, and those babies can actually grow up. K-selected species are usually outcompeted for resources by R-selected invasive species. R-selected species aren't as impacted by invader species because their population grows very quickly. They're more likely to be the invasive species. The K-selected species are outcompeted because the R-selected have that high biotic potential and a very rapid population growth. So they have a lot of organisms competing for the same resources as the K-selected species might need. K-selected species are less likely to adapt, more likely to go extinct, whereas the R-selected species have a higher chance of adaptation because they have many generations quickly and a lower chance of extinction. So just all various characteristics of those different types of species. So we've moved on here to our practice FRQ, identify one characteristic of an R-selected species that could increase the likelihood of the R-selected species becoming a more successful invasive species than K-selected species. So in other words, why are R-selected species generally invasive species, whereas K-selected species are not? Okay, if there's any questions, make sure you ask me in class. And just as a quick reminder, make sure that you're reading your textbook. We have a great textbook this year that follows our CED order, the course guide for the AP Environmental Science. So make sure you're reading that text. It's got lots of great information. Okay, see you in class.